Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Back to the Bible. Choices, they make all the differences in life. So today, Bible teacher Bryan Clark will help you move forward in faith with a look at how your choices influence not only yourself, but the people around you. Arnie Cole and Kara Whitney will join Bryan a little later in the studio to offer some tips to help you consider your choices. Now let's join Bryan Clark for today's message.
There's many of us here that if you were to look back at what really brought you to a relationship with God, what really caused you to begin pursuing God and pursuing God's Word and God's truth, it would be the struggles or the trials. But perhaps today, things are going fairly well and you're cruising along and you need to ask yourself, am I as intense about God as I was? Am I pursuing God as relentlessly now as I was when things really weren't going too well? Am I as dependent upon God? Am I praying like I was then? The reality is, in the good times, we tend to drift away. And consequently, God often pulls back what he wants to give us because we just don't handle it well. And that's what you see in the story of Noah. When Noah was in the trenches, man, he did great. But when the pressure was off and it was just Noah and his family living out their faith, he didn't do very well. And Noah got careless and Noah crashed and he burned. And we learned something about ourselves from this incident with Noah. But it's about more than that. It's about how Noah's sons reacted to Noah's sin. And I don't think that Moses is saying that this particular event set the direction of their lives. I think he is saying, let me tell you a story that reveals the heart of Shem, reveals the heart of Ham and Japheth, and show you that their heart, their way of life would determine where their descendants would travel. With that in mind, then let's pick it up again in verse 22. It says, and Ham, the father of Canaan, again that designation, saw the nakedness of his father, and he told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. Now, clearly in this text, what Ham did was very wrong, and what Shem and Japheth did was very right. There's a lot of debate about exactly what did Ham do. And the reality is we can't know for sure, but it seems from the text that the emphasis is on the fact that Ham was somehow delighting in his father's sin. Some commentators say that the statement that's made when Ham told his brothers could actually be translated, he told with delight his brothers. In other words, Ham did not have a heart for God. And Ham was living his life his own way. Ham had determined he would be God himself and he would live life his own way. And so when his father crashed and burned morally, in a sense, Ham rejoiced in that because he was tired of his dad's preaching. He was tired of his dad's message. He was tired of his dad telling him how to live. And this was kind of his way of delighting in the fact that his dad was no different than he is. It, in a sense, excused or justified his own behavior. And so in this, he found a measure of delight because he was able to say, Dad's just a big hypocrite. He's no different than anybody else. And it really exposed what was in his heart, which is the determination to live his life his own way. Now, when exactly Ham cultivated that kind of a heart, we don't know. I'm not convinced that the sons of Noah were necessarily godly men when they entered the ark. Because we're never told that. The only thing we're told is that Noah was righteous. And because of Noah's righteousness, then his sons were allowed to enter the ark. So it's possible that Ham has never had a heart for God. It's possible that he did and he drifted away. I don't think that we know that. What we know here that Ham, as the head of the race of the Canaanites, chose no longer to serve God and to be God himself, and he would then mentor his own son in that behavior, and his son would mentor his sons, and pretty soon an entire nation would fight against God. The contrast to that is found in verse 23 when it says that Shem and Japheth responded very differently. Obviously very disappointed in their father's behavior and their father's sin, But they took a blanket and they looked away and they went in and they covered his nakedness. And of course, it's a picture of restoration, of them coming alongside their father who had sinned and being a part of restoring him back to what he should be before God. And of course, even in that is this picture that Noah's life matters, therefore Noah needs to get back to living life well, and that his sons had a responsibility to be a part of that process. So while Ham basically celebrated his father's failure, the other two sons respected and loved their father and were a part of the process of restoration. I think we learn a lot about what's in our hearts by how we respond when fellow believers crash and burn morally. We learn a lot about whether or not we believe in grace. Because if we really have lost sight of grace and start to think that this is a competition, then when others fail, in a sense, that puts us one step ahead of them. And in a sense, we can then kind of glory in other people's failure. We can kind of snicker at the fact that somebody else who was such a preacher of righteousness has crashed and burned, and we say, they weren't so great after all. And in a sense, that kind of elevates us a notch, and we're now one step ahead in the race. And that's what happens when it becomes a competition. But when we're mindful of grace, we're reminded that, I don't claim to be a child of God because I think I'm better than anybody else. I claim to be a child of God because I've bowed my knee, acknowledged my sin, and confessed Jesus as my Savior. I've simply confessed my need for God, and that's the basis upon which I claim to be a child of God. Therefore, I am a recipient of God's grace, and I'm responsible then to mediate out that grace to others who fall morally. As a matter of fact, what Shem and Japheth did is clearly spelled out in Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. It would simply be the New Testament principle that is talked about in Genesis 9. It says, "Brethren, if a man or a person is caught in any trespass," which is sin, "you who are spiritual, you who are filled with the Spirit of God, you who are understanding of grace, who are walking in obedience, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thus fulfill the law of Christ." Really, that New Testament principle is what is being lived out in Shem and Japheth, where they are taking upon themselves the responsibility of walking their father back through a process of restoration to living life well again. Over the years, there's been numerous times where I, as a pastor, have been criticized for loving some believer who has sinned morally. And it becomes a public sin, and for some reason, there's some thought that we need to kick them when they're down, or we need to kick them out, or somehow we just aren't supposed to respond with love. We're supposed to make them pay for what they've done. And why we do that is because we lose sight of grace. We lose sight of the fact that I've been extended grace and I am to extend grace to others. And if someone has confessed their sin and they're repentant of that sin, it is our responsibility to put our arm around them and tell them we love them and walk them back through a process of restoration, because their life is going to affect other people's lives who will affect other people's lives. And so it's very important that we get them back on track because of what is at stake there. So our responsibility is to come alongside, lift them up, bring them back to what they should be in Christ. And that is born out of an understanding of grace. Well, Shem and Japheth had a heart for God, and that's borne out in the way that they respond. Ham did not. He was determined to live his life his own way. That too is exposed. Verse 24, "When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him." And how he knew that, he probably woke up, found the blanket, wondered how he got there, started asking questions. Isn't really that hard to figure out, I suppose. Verse 25, "So he said, 'Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers.'" Now that's an interesting statement. Why is the curse on Canaan? It wasn't Canaan that did the behavior. It was Ham, his father. I don't think what Noah is saying is these people are cursed, therefore this is how they're going to live their lives under that curse. I think it's the other way around. I think he is saying because these people have made a decision to live life this way, that they will experience the curse of God rather than the blessing of God because they are choosing to walk away from God. So I think Noah is simply saying this will be the consequences of Ham's choice and his mentoring his own son in that lifestyle, who will mentor his sons, and so on and so forth. And so I think the reason that Noah refers to Canaan is because that's the point he's making. Ham, this is what you've done to your son. And understand, because you've done that to your son will raise his children in the same way. And they will raise their children in the same way. And they will raise their children in the same way. And pretty soon, your choice, Ham, will have affected the lives of thousands of people who will fight against God and experience his wrath rather than his blessing.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Now let's return to our study with Bible teacher Bryan Clark.
This will be the consequences of Ham's choice, and pretty soon, your choice, Ham, will have affected the lives of thousands of people who will fight against God and experience his wrath rather than his blessing. I think that is confirmed by what he says to Shem. Verse 26, he also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem." Notice there he is referencing blessing to the Lord rather than blessing to Shem. And he talks about Lord in all caps, capital L-O-R-D, which, as we've studied, this is Lord, Yahweh, or Jehovah. This is the God who is intimate. But he also talks about that Shem's God is God, G-O-D, Elohim, creator God. The God that we've seen in Genesis is the God that we bow a knee and submit to. So what's being said about Shem is that Shem was intimate with God, but Shem also bowed a knee and acknowledged God as God. It's the theme we've wrestled with all the way through Genesis. Shem has said, I will bow a knee, I will acknowledge God as God. Ham is contrasted with that, implying that Ham had determined, I will be God, I will make my own decisions, I will live my life my own way, and that's why he responded the way he did to his father's sin. So I think in the description of Shem, you also have an affirmation of what was in the heart of Ham, his brother. Let Canaan be his servant. We understand as we read on that Abraham would come from the line of Shem, and from Abraham would come the Hebrew people, and from the Hebrew people would come the Messiah, and every nation, every people of the earth would bow and acknowledge Jesus the Messiah to be Lord. So in a sense, all of the nations of the world would come to serve the God that flowed out of the descendants of Shem. Verse 27, may God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. So Japheth somehow is also a part of Shem and his people, and his descendants would also, in a sense, have a heart for God. So there is this distinction between those who will be godless nations and those who would, by and large, have a heart for God. And it was determined by the choices of one person, Shem, by one person, Ham, and the choices that both of those men made. Verses 28 and 29, and Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. It's really kind of an uneventful close to the story of Noah. It ends with kind of a matter-of-fact statement that, by the way, Noah lived this long and he died, end of story. And the reason it's told that way is because this is no longer about Noah. Now it's about his three sons and their descendants, which would become the nations of the entire world. So while we've spent 4 chapters on one family, now suddenly we're going to fan this thing out to all the nations of the world. But the point that's being made is the direction that entire nations would take went all the way back to what was in the heart of one person. Ham would determine the direction of thousands of people's lives to fight against God. Shem, because of his heart for God, would affect his children, which would affect their children, and on it goes. Oftentimes we think that the decisions we make, they're kind of our own decisions, they don't affect anyone else, and we just get kind of careless in all that. And sometimes we fail to realize that we are affecting the lives of hundreds of people, because as a father, I will affect the lives of my children. And they will affect then their children and their children's children. And then you add on top of that friends and people we work with, and it's just like this wave that continues to go out that comes back to choices we make, whether those are good choices or whether they're bad choices. You know, it isn't unusual for me to talk to someone who may be 60 years of age and would talk about decisions that their parents made 50 years ago. And those decisions have dramatically affected the way they've lived their lives and still affect the way they live each day. And it's affected the way they raise their children, which affects then the way those children raise their children. And we're reminded of the incredible power of influence in the choices that we make. In order to live life well, we need to understand how dramatically our choices affect other people's choices and can set a path or direction for generations to follow. Now, let me just say this. There's no sense in going backwards and getting the guilt and beating yourself up over past choices. You can't go back and redo those. So there's nothing to be gained by that. The real issue we're dealing with is, what are the choices you're going to make today and tomorrow and the next day, because this is what you can change. This is what you can control. And to understand that our children and our friends are looking at how we're living our lives. I want to just close with this reading that I ran across recently. It says, "When you thought I wasn't looking, you hung my first painting on the refrigerator, and I wanted to paint another. When you thought I wasn't looking, you fed a stray cat, and I thought it was good to be kind to animals. When you thought I wasn't looking, you baked a birthday cake just for me, and I knew that little things were special things. When you thought I wasn't looking, you said a prayer, and I believed there was a God, and I could always talk to him. When you thought I wasn't looking, you kissed me goodnight, and I felt loved. When you thought I wasn't looking, I saw tears come from your eyes, and I learned that sometimes things hurt, but it's all right to cry. When you thought I wasn't looking, you smiled, and it made me want to look that pretty too. When you thought I wasn't looking, you cared, and I wanted to be everything I could be. When you thought I wasn't looking, I looked and wanted to say thanks for all the things you did when you thought I wasn't looking." I think that's what Moses is saying. Our children are looking. Our friends are looking. They're watching how we're living our lives. And the choices we make not only affect our own lives, but affects the lives of people we influence. They will influence others. They will influence others. And that makes every decision and every choice highly significant. Therefore, we live life well before God.
Now let's join Bryan Clark in studio with author Kara Whitney and Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole to discover some practical application from today's study.
Bryan, it is really encouraging to think how God can use our life to influence our loved ones and all of those around us. You've probably seen plenty of those types of examples, though, as a pastor.
Yeah, I think it can be encouraging or discouraging, depending on how we're living. The reality is, people are watching, our kids are watching, and they're going to learn a lot from our behavior. So to me, it's just very sobering to, as a pastor, be aware of how I'm living my life and what that teaches other people. But you do get the benefit of seeing lives changed and God's amazing power, and marriages put back together and people set free and people getting saved and growing into godly men and women. So, that's the fruit of your labor, and you have to stay long enough to see some of that.
Even in my own family, when I came to know Christ, started following him, it actually led some family members towards the Lord. So I was very grateful for that.
They're definitely watching, that's for sure.
Bryan, you talked about him delighting in the failure of his father. We love to tear people down, especially those who claim to live for God.
Yeah, so this again is where our theology matters. People want to kind of separate theology to something that makes sense at church and then you go on with your life. But our core belief system defines how we live. So if you think about, we were made to find our significance and value in being rightly related to God, but because of sin, we're cut off from God. Now I function as my own God, and I'm trying to find my own significance and value, and that creates a performance-based value system, which I think is what the New Testament calls the world, and that's really based on competition and comparison. So I'm significant compared to whom? So everything's about competition and comparison. So if it's a self-righteous system, then I'm good compared to who, and then I see people fail, and secretly I take delight in that because it makes me feel better about myself. And generally speaking, that's the world we live in. Everybody's trying to figure out where they fit in the pecking order, and they love it when Christians fail because they see Christians as kind of holier than thou, and they love it when preachers fail because it's easy then to dismiss the whole message. And we can complain about that all day long, but the fact is we're claiming to be radically changed by the power of Jesus. So we need to live that way. That's a big part of our witness because they are watching.
So yeah, it seems to me that this is also the approach we should take with unbelievers in their struggles.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because I think sometimes as believers, it's easy to jump in and throw more stones. It's like you made your bed, you can lie in it, it's your fault, I told you so. So there's that kind of this divide between Christians and non-believers, and when they fail, it's like, aha, I tried to tell you. And that's not helpful, and it's not Jesus-like at all. It's in those moments, sin has consequences, whether someone believes that or not. And sin devastates people's lives, and they've believed a lie, and now they're confused and they're hurt. And those are great moments for Christians to step in and say, what can I do to help? How can I be there for you? I can't tell you how many times I've asked that question of non-believers who have made a mess of their lives, and everybody's mad at them. And for somebody to come alongside and say, I know you're hurting right now. I just want to know what can I do to help. They don't need a lecture. They don't need more stones. This can be a pivotal moment where people experience the love and grace of Jesus in a way that maybe begins to change their story.
This is Back to the Bible with Bible teacher Bryan Clark. Thanks for taking time to be with us today. If you'd like to listen to this message again, please visit us at backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more of Bryan Clark's teaching, right here on Back to the Bible.